verse 364. If a man, seeing the rise of all things, yet perceives that Nirvana is devoid of the faults of the philosophers, this is the Nirvana as held by the wise, because of its not being annihilation. But once again, in the realm of enlightenment practice, an enlightenment practice is about our relationship with everything. Not just everything in the physical world that we find ourselves, but also everything in our mental and emotional world. That's what's going on. There's a so-called physical world with the people, things, events in it. There are our thoughts, and there are our feelings, both emotions and other sensations. So enlightenment practice is about our relationship with all of this. And that relationship is actually quite clearly indicated in this verse. If a man or enlightenment practitioner sees the rise of all things, and seeing the rise of all things implies a certain distance. You're observing it. You're observing the rise of all things, and the rise of all things can only be observed from outside all of these things. This outside is not a dislocation of some sorts. It's about not being sucked into it. All of this stuff that's been described, so-called outer and the inner, is like a whirlpool, a vortex that sucks us in. Enlightenment practice is about not being sucked in. It's about observing it. It's about being aware of it without judging it, without thinking about it, without generating more thoughts and feelings about it. So this is enlightenment practice. Bear this in mind. We'll come back to this after we've looked at the rest of this verse. So at the same time as observing the rise of all things, the enlightenment practitioner perceives that Nirvana is devoid of the faults of the philosophers. Now, it's time to look at Nirvana again. What do you know about Nirvana? You might just have heard the term, and you'll have a certain idea about it from the context within which you heard it. There's a general understanding that Nirvana is some kind of heavenly blissed out state. Something desirable. Something that we would all naturally want. We all want Nirvana. But if you've looked into this, if you've looked into what Nirvana means, then you might be in for a bit of a shock, because it's not very appealing. The word Nirvana itself means blown out. And if you look for further descriptions of what this means, you might come across a story of Nirvana being like the final snuffing out of a candle. The simile being that all our previous lives are like candles, and at the point of death, the spark of that candle is transmitted to a fresh candle in a new life, and on it goes. Each life is a candle that transmits its spark to a new candle. And Nirvana is about ending that process. No more candles snuffed out. What's the appeal of that? Well, if you find life to be a really awful experience, then it might be quite appealing. Some kind of annihilation might be quite appealing. And this is very much this sort of tone that Nirvana has. A refuge for those that can't cope. A refuge for those that find life horrible. So this is rather bleak. What a bleak philosophy to buy into. Get me out of here. I suppose if you've got that way of viewing things, that's fair enough. You're getting a way out. But it seems to be some kind of metaphorical suicide, doesn't it? And Buddhism isn't some kind of suicide cult. This understanding of Nirvana is what's described here as that of the philosophers. It's to do with annihilation. But this isn't the understanding of the Enlightenment practitioner here described as a man seeing the rise of all things. It's really about optimizing our life flow. Optimizing our being, about not being sucked into these vortices of feeling, whether they are these very deep, painful, uncomfortable feelings, or even something more positive. Because Nirvana is not a heavenly state. A heavenly state in this teaching is nothing more than a very good mood. And in this teaching we go beyond our moods altogether. We come to that point of awareness. It is this awareness which is Nirvana. Enlightenment practice is very much about practicing Nirvana.